Ready to go for it now?
Okay,
brilliant. So as Rob said, I'm a teacher of music, and I've undertaken a small school-based research project, and I decided to look at, as you can see, the impact of formal examination within KS3 music, mainly looking at students' perceptions, and I focused on students in Year 8. So what were students' perceptions of formal examination in music? Right, so the rationale is I'm a teacher of music at a context school where I also teach English, but within this context school where I started in September, students across KS3 in Year 7, 8 and 9 all sit formal examinations, and they do this in the hall to sort of mimic, obviously, GCSE exams, and they do it as part of this kind of exam fortnight, so it's all about, they have to revise, they have to go through the process that KS4 students go through, which I thought was interesting, well, especially as doing it in music. But what's relevant is that in music, in Year 8, they complete a practical assessment and then they have a week to revise. They're given some revision guides and they come and do this formal examination. And from that, they're given a mark that's reported home to parents. So it's a combination of the practical and the formal examination, reported home to parents. And why this was interesting for me is because prior to working at this particular school, I'd worked at 3 different schools as a qualified teacher teaching music, where I'd only previously used purely practical assessments to assess in music and not kind of a formal exam style thing. So I thought I was interested and I wanted to explore this and students' perceptions of it. So this particular context school, based in West Sussex in a large town, quite a big school of 1,800 students. It's mixed comprehensive. Has got a 6th form college, so it's 11-13. Currently, or last year, the results are slightly above GCSE. Slightly above average at GCSE. 5A start to C. The current Ofsted is good in all areas, although that was downgraded from outstanding before. I think what's relevant here really is that minority ethnic groups are above average and free school meals are below national average. So the questions I focused on for my research was obviously how do students perceive or how do they value the use of this formal examination in KS3 music? Is it something that challenges and inspires more able students doing assessment this way, or perhaps is it something that makes music less accessible to those who don't study or play music away from lessons? This is what I wanted to explore. It's all about musical learning. Does it enhance it or does it get in the way of it? So how does that affect it? And again, student perception. I think the previous presentation was about perception as well, a bit, wasn't it? So it's a bit of a link there. So obviously I started with literature review to explore what thoughts there were on these things, and started by looking at musical assessment, so looking at understanding assessment from a musical perspective, and Swanwick argues that it's key that it has to be a genuinely musical assessment for it to be successful in terms of learning. Lucy Green, from doing research on how popular musicians learn, found that successful learning of musical skills happened when as she states, written being secondary to oral in terms of skills of ways of learning musical skills. We've got another quote here from Faultley about how perhaps he's saying, so I'm approaching this from this point of view of written answers are not a valid way of assessing musical understanding, is what he says. So that's something I wanted to test for myself, you see. So now we're looking at informal assessment, and again it's Swanwick identifies that moving away from the informal assessment leads to, as he puts things, getting tricky. Gary Spruce has talked about holistic musical experience, and that is a combination. So in music, we look for the skills of performing, listening and composing, or listening and composing, and he's saying combine them together, you get this kind of holistic experience. which I think is interesting. And looking more at exams now, or tests, Stover defines a test as a representation of a skill. So, in other words, he highlights that you need to kind of mimic the skill that you're testing for it to be a valid, use the term valid, test, I guess. So, again, thinking about musical skills and how they've been developed through this way. So finally, the third theme in my literature review was considering assessment as a separate activity away from just the learning within the curriculum. And some of the literature here identifies how it's obviously not always a teacher's intention to assess in certain ways. It's kind of the pressures they're put upon us by Ofsted, by senior management, by comparisons to other subjects, and how assessment's something we have to do whether we like it or not. Perhaps there are cases where teachers have to do something that they're not quite agreeing with, perhaps, or so whatever happens, though, as Phil highlights, we've got to use summative results in a formative way. That's important for it to be done successfully. It's worth bearing in mind. I think I'll just move on to my methodology. So, I chose to do questionnaires and group interviews to test out my research questions. Questionnaires seemed, from my understanding, to be a sort of versatile way of collecting qualitative and quantitative data from a large group of respondents. So my aim was to test as many year 8 students as I could. Within the questionnaire I used open and closed questions. The closed questions, obviously the advantage being that they're quite straightforward to code, quick to complete for participants, whereas open questions allow respondents to kind of jot down their own response in their own terms, without the kind of limitations of having preset categories for them, which closed questions have. But the literature I read also pointed out that, of course, there's weaknesses within using questionnaires in that it's still limited to a written form of expression, which isn't always everybody's best way of expressing themselves, I guess. So that's why I used interviews as well. I chose to use group interviews rather than individual interviews. One of the reasons is because of time constraints of just one-to-one interviews and perhaps child protection considerations, then it'd be ideal to have a member of staff if it's just one-on-one. But the advantages of group interviews is that me being the researcher, I was able to ask questions for response to answer, whereas in a focus group that is more of a kind of you're kind of facilitating the whole thing, discussion among participants, but you're not getting involved in it yourself. And I was kind of trying to take a bit of an interpretive approach, but obviously limited being a teacher and limited students. But I felt like by doing a group interview that allowed me to kind of do that more so than if it had been a focus group. There we go. So the sample group, there were 106 students that I was able to sample in the end, and that's about 1/3 of the year group. We were about 300 in the year group. What's relevant here is that in the end, which I'll talk about when I come to limitations, or the questionnaires were completed 3 weeks after the exam, but I was also able to get 9 students for the group interviews, and they were done in 2 separate groups. One was a group of 5 girls, and the second one was 4 boys in the second group. This took place a bit later on, so the first one 4 weeks and the second one 5 weeks after the exam. My ethical considerations was that participation was obviously optional. All participants remained anonymous, and they were aware of this. I sought senior leadership approval for the group interviews. Parental permission was sought. The questionnaire itself was used as kind of a method of reflecting, students reflect on their learning, part of AFL within lessons at quite detailed place, and even though all students completed it, they had the option of stating that they didn't want it to be used for research, so there were a few that didn't get included because they had the option of it not being used, obviously. So, on to my findings. I thought it's worth mentioning first, I was quite surprised it was such a high amount, actually, about 60%, well, almost 3/5 of the group either sing or rap, that was an option, play an instrument or create some kind of music at home themselves, so I kind of didn't expect it to be quite that high, that many did it outside of lessons. From that, over 2/3, what's relevant is 2/3 of them admitted or kind of stated that they spent less than 30 minutes preparing for the exam, and a fifth of them didn't do any preparations at all. So it's worth bearing that in mind that when they came to the exam, they hadn't really spent a great deal of time revising, and some hadn't at all. So one of the bits of data that I thought was relevant to report here was that 2/3, or just under 2/3, thought that the exam was about the right level of difficulty. Now, I'm not sure whether they've just gone for that as kind of an easy option to say, not sure if it was easy or difficult, oh, it's about the right level for me. So it could be a case of that was perhaps why I've got such a strong, such a large amount of people that thought it was the right level, or perhaps that they just thought, no, this is a good test, it's about the right level of difficulty. And there was quite a strong response to students finding it relevant, or saying that it was a good test of what they've been learning within lessons. So they're in favour of it there by the looks of it, or a majority is. Now, so around about half thought that they've been making good or excellent progress in music, which has been good. 54%, so around about the same, just a bit higher after taking the exam. Now, what's relevant here, of course, is that they were tested 3 weeks after the exam. So obviously it's hard for them to think back to, well, I'll talk about limitations again later on, but they had to think back to, their before the exam, which is obviously quite a hard thing to do a few weeks after. 28% thought they were making more progress as a result of the exam, and 56% thought no change at all. So this was something I was really particularly interested in, which was obviously the whole reason why I'm looking at this in the first place, is because, well, one of the things I didn't put on the research questions was, we're interested in knowing about, or trying to understand how, or as a school or as music teachers, how can we strengthen the amount of people that take students that opt for GCSE music. So what's interesting is that some here, about 43% feel like it hasn't made a difference, the exam result that they received hasn't changed mine, but perhaps 42% feel that maybe they're less likely to take it as a result of the exam. So I did ask on the questionnaire if they could explain why. Here's some of the responses I got. So one viewpoint was, I had a low score, so therefore I wouldn't go to do GCSE. Someone, of course, on the other hand, has put, well, I got good results, so I'm considering taking it. And I'm assuming it's just kind of, well, it's only an exam, hasn't really affected me, but I don't want to do more. I thought I've presented it in this way of kind of, again, here's some more responses to this question. What would help you make better progress in music lessons, which was important to know? No surprise that obviously some people are saying things like less tests, so that's not groundbreaking stuff. Less theory, more practical, some more singing, more practicals. Yeah, more group class. Again, one thing with this is perhaps it's a bit biased to, well, this seemed to represent the general kind of responses I got there. From the group interviews, again, it's been a small scale project. I haven't quite worked out the best way of representing the overall group interview perceptions, but I just thought I'd give some snapshot responses here. So we've had one response, or I had one response. I do think the exam was easy for people who can read music, who already understand how to play an instrument. Again, this links back to the literature. Those people get higher scores, one perception. But someone else has said an exam shouldn't be based on just doing instruments, so this person felt that practical assessment shouldn't just be playing instruments, but actually knowledge is important. So this is one viewpoint there. Thank you. And finally, another viewpoint I thought worth sharing. As someone said, with music, you feel like you only want to play the music, but it is necessary for you to do written work as well. Of course, it's not the most fun thing to do, but this person here is highlighting, you know, it's what I used as the word necessary, which was interesting. So, my recommendations from my findings. And I should sort of link this with the limitations, which is coming next, but what surprised me the most was at the school, it's obviously this exam fortnight is an effective thing because it seems to be embedded into students' mindsets that they think, the impression I got was that they find it quite valuable, more so than I had expected actually. I thought there would be kind of, my perception is negative, but they seem to be a lot more accepting of the valueness of formal examination. So not as one-sided as expected. I feel like again this kind of links to the literature here, but a recommendation I would give is that perhaps assessments really do need to be kept musical. Testing musical skills is still the most important thing to be doing with the music. But they did highlight a lot within the questionnaires that practical lessons perhaps aren't currently varied enough, and they are, you know, there are improvements within the practical assessment as well, which is interesting. I think that affected the results that I had anticipated. Again, it all comes down to successful learning, and they seem to just say that formal examination is, as long as it's helping them to learn, then it's fine by them. That's the impression that I seem to get. More composing tasks. Relevant that every school is different, so I highlighted at the start that, you know, I hadn't done it at other schools, but I am doing it this one. I wanted to explore why. But of course, one thing that I picked up from all is that at the end of the day, every school is different, and every culture within that school is different in terms of the learning community. But there were definite limitations within my research. If I was to do it again, I would definitely want to change these things. I mean, at the end of the day, I did research opinions about what they thought, what they perceived about the exam, which, in hindsight, definitely would have been better if I had have done some research before the exam, some research after. There was a slight delay in the research collection. It wasn't quite as immediate as I would have liked to have been due to some sort of scheduling limitations at the time to do with how it all fitted into reporting sessions of parents' evenings to other events that were going on in the school, and it just got pushed back to having to be done, like I said, in the end, 3 weeks after the exam itself. There were a lot of other factors I could have explored, such as how about the results of other subjects? Did that influence their decision about what they thought about music, and if they did well in one subject, did that make them think, perhaps, you know, that changes my mind about music, or if I did well in music, it's like a nice surprise. So I could have found out more about that. The group interviews did veer off topic easily, so even though I had a set of kind of questions I wanted to ask, I tried to turn it into a discussion. It would kind of veer off in one direction quite easily, and perhaps I didn't quite get the data I was looking for from the group interviews would be a limitation. But what suggests me a very good activity that I wish I had have incorporated into it more was this idea of doing sort of card sort activities, draw themes out a bit more, this really focusing on their themes that they could have identified themselves. And one thing that was a limitation of the group interview was some group students were obviously more influenced by others. They came as friendship groups, the people that volunteered. You know, they had to go home and seek parental consent and everything, but they agreed to do it as a friendship group, which was an interesting way, I think, of interviewing. And perhaps some comparison to other music departments would have helped. And there we go, there's my bibliography, and the questions are invited after Philippa's presentation by the sounds of it. So.